It was the major trade union at the time, founded by Larkin and Connolly, and the IWW was kind of set up to organise women within that. So it was involved in a number of strikes in the first kind of 30 years of its existence. Most famously, Rosie Hackett was one of its founders, where we'll be ending up just near the Rosie Hackett Bridge. But the strike we're going to talk about today is the strike by laundry workers in the mid-1940s that the IWW were extremely prominent in organising. So during World War II, you had kind of two things happening in Irish workplaces. The first was the same surge in female workers that you saw in lots of other European countries. But the second thing was, I guess, in spite of the strength of trade unions for a couple of decades at the start of the Free State, you had, I suppose, a popular sentiment that it wouldn't be fair to carry out a strike during the so-called emergency, which is what World War II was referred to in Ireland. But in spite of that, since 1940, the union had been signed up to what was called a Women Workers' Charter. And in 1940, that had set out kind of the basic conditions of hygiene and safety for workplaces. So it called for, to quote, adequate heating arrangements, sufficient lavatory and basin accommodation, a canteen apart from the cloakroom large enough for the staff employed, provided with equipment for simple meals, a cloakroom apart from the factory, free from dust and suitably equipped, and very progressively, it also called for a bike shed in every workplace, which is not something that we have in many of our workplaces today, incredibly. And by 1943, the Executive Board had outlined a women workers programme for industrial workers as the war started to wind down. And at that point, notice was served to every firm employing members of the Irish Women Workers Union, not just the laundries, but right across those workplaces, that there would be a number of claims put in over the coming years. The first set, things that they felt needed to be implemented immediately, and then they also gave notice that a whole load of other conditions were going to be fought for once the war was over. So in 1943, the Women Workers Union was very much setting out its stall in relation to what it wanted to do. So when the Dublin District Laundries Association decided to strike or to begin industrial action in 1943, it was very much seen as the blueprint for all of those, I suppose, women workplaces or women predominant workplaces where the IWW was organised. Its main call at the beginning, the laundry strike, was for 2 weeks of paid holidays for all workers in the laundry industry, something that wasn't available to industrial workers at the time. And it had been a long time coming. In 1936, the Conditions of Employment Act had led to huge awareness around workplace rights amongst women and other workers, and a number of laundry women had begun to refuse to turn around laundry in 2 days, which effectively was kind of a special offer that the employers would offer, a discount offer, or we can get it done in record time, but obviously led to massive overwork on workers. And in 1939, a report by shop stewards in the Women Workers Union said that both the employers and the general public must cease to regard the laundresses as robots. And before the war, women had begun to demand also that men should be entirely removed from the laundry industry. I'm not sure how widespread the sentiment was, but it was definitely there amongst a number of them. And eventually a compromise had been reached that across the Laundries Association, any new jobs in running machines would be given over to women only, and also that all members, male and female, of the union would support the objective that all women should be paid at least as much as men were paid in the industry. So in 1945, the strike properly began. Labour had been insecure. In 1941, the IWW urged the heads of a number of religious orders to stop competing with professional laundries. So in April 1941, in fact, it was kind of considered to be well known that one of the things that was undercutting the wages of workers in the laundries were the institutional laundries in in things like mother and baby homes. But in 41 it actually became public knowledge that one of the laundries in Bloomfield in Donnybrook had actually, or one of the laundries in Bloomfield had lost a contract for kind of soldiers' apparel for the military, effectively, to a mother and baby home in Donnybrook, and 28 women workers were laid off as a result of the contract being lost. So, you know, you had this very old-fashioned in one sense, but also very recognisable undercutting of, you know, good unionised jobs by ununionised, poor quality jobs, where those workers were also exploited at the same time. So in 1945, a strike was eventually announced, with the Federated Union of Employers, kind of the IBEC of the time, effectively immediately dismissing the claim for 2 weeks holidays as being unworkable. In July, 3 weeks out from the date proposed for a full strike, the union issued a leaflet describing the double standard where non-industrial workers, so administrative workers and professionals, were entitled to 2 weeks paid employment, but those engaged in hard labour were not. And they said the professional or administrative worker, the clerical or distributive worker, the shareholder who does no work at all is not asked to content himself with a bare week's holiday, but the manual worker carries the brand of a hand and operative, a cog in the wheel of production, and in spite of this is not entitled to the holidays. And that month, 779 workers in the laundries union voted to go on strike. Only 54 resisted it. I should have to tell Janet, because she's a cyclist, that one of the demands of the women workers in the early 30s was for a bicycle shed in every workplace.
Exactly my reaction.
We'll come back to that. So our members, they said, our members, convinced that the time has come for our long-standing claim for a fortnight's annual leave must be pressed to a conclusion, have decided that they will cease work in all Dublin laundries on and from Saturday the 21st. And although the trade union movement was quite plagued at this point by internal dissent, and in 1945 it actually split, support for holidays for industrial workers was quite forthcoming. So it was agreed that this particular gap was something particularly egregious, and there was large-scale support immediately for it. During the strike, the workers were often critical of media coverage that they received, again something quite familiar to us. And at one point, 4 laundresses wrote to the Irish Times criticising their focus on kind of banal issues and not on workers' issues. And they wrote, "We read your paper, sometimes pasted up in those Fleet Street windows, and we see it full of news about foreign countries, pictures of people nobody has ever seen in Dublin. And Mr. Quidnunc, the journalist, writes about all the fun going on at the tattoo and the food and drink at the Great Ball and the boxing match for £10 a seat to watch it. And Miles Nagopoline has a column all to itself. Is it funny? We don't really know. If he wrote in Irish, we might understand it a bit better than the grand English he uses. And you had nearly a page of a letter from New York telling how girls there do their hair. But with all of that, you have only 2 lines or so for 1,500 Dublin women on strike, and no word at all about the sort of work that they have to do." So there's massive criticism of the remove of the media and the establishment. So the employers eventually, after months of strike, agreed to set up a court of inquiry as requested by the union, and called for a resumption of work before this was to be set up. So there was kind of a back and forth for a lengthy period of time where employers were effectively refusing to negotiate without the workers going back to work. The workers were saying, we're not going to go back to work until you start negotiating and concessions have been made, which again is something very familiar in all of the industrial disputes that we see, including the recent or the current nurses strike, do workers concede to start to go back to work before negotiations start? In this instance, the union refused and again appealed to the public for renewed support. And the critical thing in them being able to hold out was that the unions, was that the workers themselves, the public was overwhelmingly supportive of the 1,500 women out on strike. So a large demonstration was announced for the 23rd of September on O'Connell Street, and a whole rake of demonstrations were held after that. And despite indications, and the women refused to go back to work until concessions had been made. And eventually, in late October, the Federation of the Union of Employers granted the claims of the women. And on the 30th of October 1946, measures were introduced to grant all industrial workers 2 weeks paid leave with full compensation for anybody working for 2 years. So we begin on a success, a really remarkable success by a group of women who at the time saw themselves as quite skilled workers. And yes.